What I'm about to share happened just days ago, in 2025. I still can't wrap my head around it. It began when I moved into an old apartment in the city. I was thrilled to finally have a place of my own, even if it was on the 7th floor of a crumbling building. The rent was suspiciously low, but I convinced myself I'd found a hidden gem. The place had character, creaky floors, antique fixtures, and an elevator that groaned every time it moved. The landlord, Mr. Grayson, was an odd man. He handed me the keys with a handshake that lingered too long and a warning to respect the building's history. For the first few nights, it was peaceful. I unpacked, decorated, and settled into my new life. The usual sounds of an old building filled the air. The hum of radiators, faint murmurs from neighbors, and pipes that groaned like they were alive. But then, things started to change. It was small at first. I'd leave the kitchen tidy before bed, only to find cabinets ajar in the morning. Lights flickered, but only in the living room. The air felt thicker, heavier, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I brushed it all off, until the night I heard the whispers. I was scrolling through my phone in bed when I heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible murmurs coming from the living room. At first, I thought it was the neighbors. But as I listened, I realized the voices weren't coming through the walls. They were inside my apartment. My heart raced as I crept to the living room with my phone's flashlight. The whispers stopped the moment I entered. The room was still, but the silence felt charged, like something was waiting, watching. I didn't sleep that night. And the next morning, I told myself I was imagining things. But the unease grew. A week later, I was in the shower when I heard a loud crash. Wrapping a towel around myself, I ran to the kitchen. Every dish in the drying rack lay shattered on the floor. The rack itself hadn't moved, as if an unseen hand had swept them off. My chest tightened as I cleaned up, every nerve on edge. Then the dreams began. Every night, the same vision, a woman standing at the foot of my bed. Her hair was long and matted, obscuring her face. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. At first, I thought it was sleep paralysis, but then it started happening when I was wide awake. I'd feel an invisible weight on my chest, pressing harder and harder, making it impossible to breathe. Desperate for answers, I started researching the building. What I found made my stomach drop. In the 1950s, a woman named Eleanor had lived in my apartment. She was a recluse, obsessed with the occult. Neighbors reported hearing chants and seeing strange symbols in her windows. One day, she vanished without a trace. The police found her apartment empty, except for a chair facing the corner of the living room and a mirror cracked clean down the middle. Her disappearance was never solved. Suddenly, everything clicked. The whispers, the dreams, the feeling of being watched. She was still here, and she wasn't happy I had moved in. I decided to document what was happening. That night, I set up cameras in the living room and bedroom. I stayed up late, pretending to watch movies, but every muscle in my body was taut with dread. Around 3 a.m., the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged the air, and goosebumps prickled my skin. Then, the whispers began again. This time, they were louder, insistent. I gripped my phone and followed the sound to the living room. The whispers stopped the second I entered. For a moment, all was still. Then, one of the cameras toppled over with a loud crash. My scream echoed through the apartment as I bolted back to my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. What I saw chilled me to my core. In the living room, a shadowy figure appeared near the window. It was tall and impossibly thin, with hair that hung like a curtain over its face. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. In the bedroom footage, the door creaked open on its own. The same figure peeked inside before the recording abruptly ended. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my belongings and left that day without so much as a goodbye to Mr. Grayson. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's presence hadn't stayed behind. I stayed at a friend's house, but even there, strange things began to happen. One night, as I lay on the couch, scrolling through my phone, I saw the screen flicker. For a second, it wasn't my reflection staring back at me, but hers. The same matted hair, the same dark silhouette. I threw the phone down, but the room felt colder, and I swore I heard a faint whisper coming from the corner of the room. My friend Lila noticed my paranoia. She asked me what was wrong, but how could I explain something like this? I tried to downplay it, blaming stress from the move, but deep down, I knew I wasn't safe. None of us were. A few nights later, Lila woke up screaming. She said she saw a woman standing at the foot of her bed, pointing at her. She described Eleanor perfectly, even though I had never told her about the dreams. We tried everything. We burned sage, sprinkled salt, even contacted a medium. The medium, an older woman named Clara, walked into the apartment and immediately turned pale. "She's bound to you," Clara said. "You brought her here. She's angry, and she won't rest until she gets what she wants." "What does she want?" I asked, my voice trembling. Clara hesitated. "It's not something she'll tell me, but whatever it is, you need to figure it out before it's too late." The next few days were a blur. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound felt amplified. I barely slept, and when I did, the dreams were worse. Eleanor wasn't just standing anymore. She was moving closer. Each night, she took a step toward me, and every morning, I woke up with fresh scratches on my arms and legs. The breaking point came when Lila's dog, Max, started barking furiously at the empty corner of the living room. He growled, his fur standing on end, before letting out a yelp and bolting into the other room. When I checked on him, he was trembling under the bed, refusing to come out. That night, I decided to confront Eleanor directly. Armed with nothing but sheer desperation, I sat in the living room at 3 a.m., the time when the activity was always the strongest. I turned off all the lights, lit a single candle, and spoke into the darkness. "Eleanor, I know you're here. What do you want from me?" The silence was deafening. Then the whispering started again, growing louder and louder until it was almost a scream. The candle flickered wildly before going out, and then, for the first time, I saw her clearly. She stood just a few feet away, her face finally visible. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale, and stretched tight over her bones. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. But her expression said it all: rage, pain, and a deep, unrelenting sorrow. I ran out of the apartment and haven't been back since. Even now, I don't feel safe. Wherever I go, I feel her presence. Sometimes, I catch a glimpse of her in mirrors, or hear her whispers in the dead of night. I don't know what she wants, or if she'll ever stop. But one thing is clear. Eleanor isn't just a part of that apartment's history. She's a part of mine now. On January 7th, 2025, I was driving back home after visiting a friend who lived deep in the mountains. The forecast didn't predict anything serious, but you know how it is. Weather can change in the blink of an eye. The snowstorm hit out of nowhere. At first, the snow was light, just flurries drifting through the headlights, but it quickly picked up, turning into a full blizzard. The snow began to build up on the road, covering it in thick, uneven layers. I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me, and my windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the heavy, wet snow. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the road, her back slightly hunched, as though the weight of the cold was pressing her down. Her figure was barely visible through the swirling snow, and for a moment, I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, she was real. She looked like she was in her 20s, pale as a ghost, dressed in a thin hoodie and jeans, no coat, no gloves, nothing to protect her from the biting cold. Her hair was long, dark, and matted from the snow, and her face was hidden behind the strands that blew wildly in the wind. I slowed my car, my heart pounding. Who in the world would be out here in this storm, dressed like that? Something felt wrong. The whole situation felt off, like I was in a scene from one of those horror movies where the main character makes the worst possible decisions. But I couldn't just leave her there. Could I? I rolled down my window, the wind howling in, and shouted, "Are you okay?" She didn't move at first, just standing there as the snow swirled around her. For a moment, I thought she hadn't heard me, but then she slowly turned her head. Her eyes, those eyes, were wide, like she was on the verge of panic. "Can you give me a ride? I live just down the road." Her voice was soft, almost whispering, barely audible over the wind. It was the desperation in her voice that made me act. I'm no hero, but I couldn't just leave her to freeze in the storm. I unlocked the door, and she climbed in without saying another word. The moment she sat down, I felt it. A coldness, like a gust of icy wind, had followed her into the car. The warmth of the heater seemed to do nothing for her. She was still shaking, her skin almost blue, and her breath came out in little white clouds. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "Where do you live?" She barely responded, just shaking her head. "Just down the road," she repeated, almost mechanically. "I need to get home." I tried to push for more details, but she stayed silent. Her gaze was fixed on something outside the window, her eyes unfocused. The snow was falling harder now, and I was beginning to feel a sense of unease. Her silence, the coldness, something wasn't right. I tried to make small talk to break the tension. "So, where are you coming from?" "Visiting someone," she murmured, but she didn't elaborate. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. She was staring ahead now, her lips barely moving, her voice hardly a whisper. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right, and that's when she started humming. It was soft at first, a melody that seemed both old and unfamiliar, almost haunting. The tune was slow, like a lullaby, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. "Is that a song?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, trying to shake off the feeling of dread crawling up my spine. She didn't answer at first, and then, after a long, tense pause, she stopped humming. But when she spoke, it wasn't the voice I'd heard before. "It's not a song," she said, her voice chillingly calm. "It's a warning." I froze. "What? What do you mean by that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my pulse quickening. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her head slowly toward me, her eyes hollow, empty. There was no warmth in her gaze, just a cold, distant look that made my stomach churn. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice low, almost as if she was speaking to herself. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking now. "You're going to be sorry," she whispered. That was it. I didn't know what she meant or what was happening, but I knew I had to get away. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I wasn't sure where to turn, but instinctively, I took a sharp right onto a small, unmarked road, hoping it would lead me to some kind of shelter, a gas station, anything. But the road didn't get better, it got worse. The snow was deeper here, the path even more treacherous. The trees on either side of the road bent inward, their bare branches clawing at the car like skeletal hands, as if trying to pull us off the road. "Are we close?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, but my anxiety was rising. She didn't answer. I glanced at her. She was staring straight ahead, not even blinking, her expression unnervingly blank. The car was sliding slightly now, the tires struggling for traction. I tightened my grip on the wheel. "Hey," I said, my voice trembling. "Where is your house? Are we close?" She didn't move. She didn't speak, but I could feel her eyes on me, and when I looked over at her again, her lips curled into a smile. But it wasn't a kind smile. It wasn't human. "It's right here," she whispered. Before I could react, she reached over and grabbed the wheel, yanking it violently to the left. I screamed, but it was too late. The car spun out of control, sliding across the icy road, the tires screeching. I remember the feeling of helplessness, the sudden weightlessness as the car careened off the road, and then everything went black. When I woke up, the car was tilted, half buried in a snowbank. My head was spinning, but I was still alive. I looked to my right. The passenger seat was empty. The door was wide open, and the wind was howling in, snow pouring through the gap. My heart pounded as I stumbled out of the car, calling out for her. There was no answer. The storm was too loud, and the world was too silent. I looked around, my breath shallow, my chest tight with fear. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. But then I saw it. On the inside of my windshield was a handprint, a wet, cold handprint. But it wasn't mine. I stood frozen for a moment, the cold seeping into my bones. I don't know who or what she was, but I knew one thing for sure. I'd never, ever be driving on roads like that again. And every night, when the wind howls outside my window, I hear the humming. Soft, faint, like a lullaby. And it's always getting closer. It started with a message, a simple text from an unknown number. At first, I thought it was a wrong number, or maybe one of those spam messages that people send to scare you. But the words on the screen made my heart skip a beat. You shouldn't have moved in. It seemed like a prank. I shrugged it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It's hard to explain, but when I saw those words, I felt a sudden chill, like a presence was watching me. I tried to ignore it. I had just moved into this apartment, and everything was supposed to be starting fresh. A new chapter, a new life. But something wasn't right. The building itself was old, cracked walls, creaky floors, and the smell of mildew lingering in the air. But it was cheap, and it was quiet, so I didn't mind much. Or at least, I didn't mind at first. The night I received that message, I stayed up late, unpacking some boxes in the living room. I was tired, my eyes heavy, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. There was something about the apartment, something in the air that made me restless. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I could hear the wind howling through the cracks in the windows. I checked my phone again, looking for an escape from the eerie atmosphere. The message was still there. I couldn't delete it. Something about it, something about the way it made me feel, kept me glued to the screen. I had to do something to distract myself, so I decided to explore the apartment more. The hallways were narrow, and the walls seemed to close in as I walked. I reached the old wooden door that led to the storage closet. It was locked, but there was something off about it. The keyhole was strange, too large, like it had been tampered with. I tried not to think too much about it and pushed the thought away. The message still burned in the back of my mind as I finally decided to turn in for the night. My bed felt stiff and unfamiliar. I tried to relax, tried to get some sleep, but the whispers started. Soft at first, like a voice barely audible over the wind. You shouldn't have moved in. It repeated itself, over and over, like a mantra. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the words seemed to be coming from the walls. It sounded like it was inside the apartment, inside my head. The floorboards creaked outside my room, and the whispers grew louder. I bolted upright, heart pounding. But there was nothing there. No one. Nothing. I stared at the door, my breathing shallow. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they had started. I lay there, frozen, unsure of what to believe. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up I felt different. My skin was cold, clammy. The air in the room had grown thick. It wasn't just the physical environment. It felt like something had changed, like something was watching me. I checked my phone again, thinking it might give me some sense of control, some relief. But the same message was there, waiting for me. You shouldn't have moved in. That was the first night. The second night was worse, much worse. The apartment felt colder, even though the heating was on full blast. I couldn't explain it. The air had this heavy, suffocating quality, like it was filled with static. The whispers didn't stop, but now they came from all around me, closer, louder. I couldn't tell if they were outside my window, in the walls, or in my head. All I could hear was that voice, telling me over and over, you shouldn't have moved in. And then I found the key. It was on the coffee table, right where I had left it earlier in the day. But I hadn't put it there. I remember looking at the table in the morning and seeing nothing. But now, there it was. The key, small and black, gleaming as though it had been waiting for me to notice it. Something about it felt wrong. I don't know why, but I picked it up. As soon as my fingers brushed against the cold metal, a wave of nausea washed over me. My vision blurred for a moment, and I had to steady myself against the table to keep from collapsing. I shouldn't have touched it. I set the key down quickly and backed away, but it wasn't just the physical reaction that unsettled me. It was the feeling I got when I looked at it. I don't know how to explain it, like something was inside the key, something alive, watching me, waiting. That night, the footsteps came. They weren't outside my door this time. They were inside my apartment. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. But when the tapping started, slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I stayed in bed, too afraid to move. The footsteps came closer and closer. I could hear them right outside my door. I didn't dare open it. I didn't want to know who or what was on the other side. Then came the scratching. It wasn't like nails against wood. It was worse, like something dragging itself across the floor, scraping against the walls. It grew louder, closer. And then, in the darkness, I heard the whisper again, this time, right next to my ear. "You shouldn't have moved in." The words felt like they were pressing against my skull, suffocating me. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and I grabbed my phone, dialing the only number I could think of, my friend, Sarah. But when she picked up, there was nothing but static. Just the crackling sound of something interfering with the signal. I heard her voice, but it wasn't clear. It was distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away, and I knew right then that whatever was happening wasn't just a coincidence. The next few days felt like I was walking in a haze. The apartment had become darker, more oppressive. The next few days felt like I was walking in a haze. The apartment had become darker, more oppressive. The key never left my mind. It stayed on the coffee table, never moving, never changing, as if it was waiting for me to unlock something I wasn't ready to face. The whispers were constant. They followed me wherever I went, creeping in at the edges of my thoughts. The footsteps didn't stop. They came every night, closer each time. They became faster, more frantic, until they were running down the hall, banging against the door. Every night, I locked myself in and prayed for morning to come. But no one came. No one ever came. As the days dragged on, I began to feel like I was losing touch with reality. I couldn't remember what time it was half the time, and when I looked at the clock, it always seemed to be a few minutes behind or ahead of where it should be. The house seemed to be living with me, breathing with me. It made me feel trapped, as though I was part of its atmosphere, suffocating in its old walls. That night, something was different. The apartment was too silent. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the key. For some reason, I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The longer I stared, the more it seemed to pulse, like it was waiting, eager to be used. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Not again. I wasn't sure I could handle what would happen if I did. But then, there was a knock. A soft, polite knock at the door. I hadn't expected anyone. I didn't know anyone in this building. My heartbeat picked up. I stood still, just listening. Another knock, louder this time. I froze. I slowly walked to the door, my pulse in my throat, and peered through the peephole. There were two figures standing on the other side, blurred shapes, but human, at least from what I could tell. Their faces were obscured by shadows. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. I stayed there, frozen in place, for what felt like an eternity. The knock came again, but this time it wasn't soft. It was rapid, desperate, almost frantic. The voices came next, and they were unlike anything I had ever heard before. They weren't even speaking English. It was a mix of guttural sounds and strange murmurs, like a language I couldn't comprehend. The voices grew louder until it was unbearable. I could feel them scratching at my mind, invading my thoughts. They were calling to me, urging me to open the door. They promised me safety. They promised me peace. But I knew better. I knew that whatever was on the other side wasn't here to help. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. I couldn't breathe. The whole apartment was closing in on me. The whispers returned, even louder now. They were all around me, filling my ears with their warnings. I grabbed my phone and dialed the landlord's number. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. It picked up, but it wasn't the landlord's voice that answered. It was a distorted, inhuman voice, so low, so distorted, that it made my skin crawl. "You shouldn't have moved in." I slammed the phone down, not even thinking about the consequences. I didn't care anymore. I just needed to get out. I tried to leave through the back door. I needed to get away from this nightmare. I threw on my coat, grabbed my purse, and ran toward the exit. But when I reached the door, it wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't budge. I pulled on it with all my strength, but it was as if something invisible was holding it shut. I slammed into it with my shoulder, and it still didn't move. I was trapped. I turned to look around the room, my panic rising, and that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the shadows, a figure stood. A tall, thin silhouette that seemed to be moving in and out of focus. I couldn't see its face. There was no face, just a dark void, like the very air around it was being sucked into it. It wasn't human. I couldn't move. My body froze as I stared at the figure. It seemed to be watching me, studying me. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement, it stepped toward me. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "You shouldn't have moved in." I stumbled backward, my legs shaking. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It didn't speak, but I heard the words in my head. "You shouldn't have moved in." My mind was racing, desperately searching for an escape, a way to get out of this madness. But there was nowhere to go. The windows were sealed shut. The walls seemed to press in on me. The shadows were alive, creeping closer with each passing second. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then the figure moved again, closer. It reached out toward me, its long, skeletal fingers brushing the air. The coldness radiated from it, chilling me to the bone. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. I didn't even know where I was going, but I had to get away from that thing. I ran down the hall, towards the staircase, desperate to get out of the building. I ran into something else. Another figure, a woman, standing in the middle of the hallway, her face pale and expressionless. Her clothes were torn and tattered, as though she had been through something terrible. She didn't speak. She just stared at me. Her eyes were hollow, empty. I ran past her, but she didn't move. She didn't follow me. She didn't need to. I could feel her presence even now as I made my way back to the stairs. The building was alive, a dark entity of its own, and it wanted me. I finally managed to get out. I didn't care where I went, but I had to get away. I spent the next few days trying to recover. I stayed at a friend's place. But even then, the feeling didn't leave me. The whispers followed me. The shadows followed me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The figures. The empty eyes. I had to know what was happening. I had to find out the truth about that building. I did some digging, finding out that the apartment had a long history. The landlord was a man who had disappeared years ago, leaving no trace. People had lived there before, but none of them stayed long. There were rumors, whispers of people hearing things, seeing things, strange occurrences that no one could explain. The building was cursed. It had been built on an old burial ground, a place where people had been lost, forgotten, and left to die. The spirits of the dead lingered there, and they never left. And now I had become part of that curse. I had become one of them. I tried to go back to the apartment, to face whatever it was that had taken over that place. But when I arrived, it was gone. The building was empty, abandoned. No sign of the landlord, no sign of the key. But I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. The last whisper I heard was the loudest, and it came from right behind me. I couldn't run anymore. I should have known it wasn't over. I should have known that the apartment, that cursed building, would never truly release me. But I couldn't stop myself. There was this nagging feeling, a sensation deep inside that told me I had to go back. Maybe to face whatever haunted that place. or maybe just to understand what had happened. I returned a week later, despite all the warnings my mind was screaming at me. The air outside felt thick with dread, and every step I took toward the building was one of reluctance. I had to know the truth. Why had I been chosen? What had I done to deserve this? When I arrived, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The building wasn't the same. It was different. The walls, once old and cracked, now looked brand new, almost pristine. The windows gleamed as if freshly washed. There was no sign of the decay I had seen before. But something was off. I stood in front of the door, my hand hovering over the handle. The door seemed to hum under my touch, vibrating slightly as though it was alive. The moment I stepped inside, the air thickened, becoming stifling. The familiar coldness swept over me, creeping under my skin, making my hair stand on end. The building was alive. I didn't know how else to describe it, but the very structure felt sentient, aware of my every move. The shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, their shapes twisting in ways that defied logic. The whispers followed me, louder than ever, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. The voice was different now, angrier, more malicious. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a growl, a warning that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I walked through the apartment, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The floors creaked underfoot, and the walls seemed to press in with every step I took. I passed the kitchen, the bathroom, the living room, every room I had explored before. Everything looked just as it had when I first moved in, but somehow wrong, distorted. I stood in front of the storage closet again, the one I'd tried to open before, the one that had been locked. I felt an overwhelming urge to unlock it, to see what was behind that door. I couldn't explain why, but the key seemed to call to me. It was on the floor in front of the closet, just like before. But now, it looked different. The once small black key had grown larger, almost grotesque in its size. It shimmered with a dark, oily sheen, its edges jagged, as though it had been forged in some forgotten, hellish place. I reached down and picked it up. The moment my fingers touched it, I felt a sharp pain shoot through my hand. I dropped it immediately, but the pain lingered, crawling up my arm, sharp and biting. I stared at the key, wondering what the hell was going on. And then, the door to the storage closet creaked open, slowly, painfully slowly, as though the hinges had been stiffened with age. I could hear the rustling sound coming from the darkness within, like something was shifting, moving. The whispers intensified. I stepped back, heart racing, fear gripping me. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was inside, but I couldn't help. I peeked inside. The closet was empty, or so it seemed at first. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw it. A shape in the corner, something hunched and misshapen. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows. But no, it was real. A figure, an old man, his skin stretched tight over his bones, his eyes wide and hollow, was crouching in the corner. His mouth was open, a grotesque grin plastered across his face. He didn't move, he didn't speak, but his eyes locked onto mine. "You shouldn't have moved in." The words were coming from him now. They didn't just echo, they bled from his lips, as if they were a part of him, a curse tied to his very existence. The room seemed to grow colder, the walls closing in, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The darkness around me pressed down like a weight. And then, I heard it. A noise. Something deep in the apartment, far off, but loud enough to shake me to my core. It sounded like scratching, like something was clawing its way through the walls, trying to break through. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as though something, or someone, was desperate to escape. I turned around, panic flooding my senses. But before I could make it to the door, the room plunged into darkness. I couldn't see. I couldn't hear anything but the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I stumbled through the dark, feeling my way toward the exit. But no matter how hard I tried, it felt like the walls were closing in on me, the air growing thicker. The whispers, those damn whispers, were all around me. A hand brushed my shoulder, ice cold and clammy. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness. The oppressive, suffocating darkness. And the whispers. Always the whispers. And then, I saw it. A figure. A tall, shadowy silhouette, standing at the end of the hallway. It was watching me. And I knew. I knew that it wasn't human. I didn't have the strength to fight it. I didn't have the will to keep running. I fell to my knees, overcome with the weight of it all. And then, in the darkness, I heard it. One final whisper, one final command. You're never leaving. I couldn't run anymore. The weight of the whispers was unbearable. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I could feel the walls themselves pressing in on me, suffocating me. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but it felt like hours, days, maybe. I lost all sense of reality. The world had become a dark, twisted nightmare that wouldn't release me. That's when I realized something. The voices grew louder, more frantic. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking, my mind reeling with the terrible realization. There was no escape. No one would come to help me. No one would hear my cries. The figure in the hallway, the one that had been watching me, moved. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. Its form shifted, elongated, as if it was stretching, twisting, bending in ways that defied nature. It didn't have a face, at least not one I could see. Just darkness. A void. And that void was coming for me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, as though the air itself had turned to stone. My limbs felt heavy, like lead. I was paralyzed. The darkness wrapped around me, and I felt myself being drawn toward it. You're never leaving. The voice came from everywhere, from within the walls, from the shadows themselves. The room grew colder, impossibly cold. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the thing before me, the thing that had no form, no face. It wasn't even human. It was the building. It was the darkness. It was everything. I stumbled backward, trying to escape, but there was no way out. I could feel the walls closing in, the shadows rising up to swallow me whole. I ran blindly through the halls, but they all led to the same place, the dark figure, waiting for me. The whispers followed me, louder than ever. The shadows danced along the walls, stretching toward me like hands, pulling me closer to the thing that waited at the end of the hallway. There was no escape. No escape from the building. No escape from the curse. No escape from the thing that had claimed me as its own. And then, as I reached the end of the hallway, the darkness consumed me. I felt it tugging at my soul, pulling me into a place where time and space had no meaning. I felt myself being torn apart, piece by piece, as the darkness took hold of me. But even as I screamed, even as I begged, the whispers continued. The apartment is empty now. At least, it looks that way. The key is gone, though I know it's still out there somewhere, waiting for the next person to fall victim to it.